Dixie. Today we are joined by Howard Sachs. He is Professor Emeritus of Sociology at Kenyon College, although he just recently retired. He also served as a senior advisor to the president and provost. He has been the director of Rural Life Center, and he has coordinated educational, scholarly, and public projects to ensure the vitality of local rural life. He has served on panels of the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities, and is the recipient of over 40 grants and fellowships for scholarly research and public programs, for which he has received numerous state and national awards. In addition to 2 books, his publications have appeared in a wide variety of scholarly journals, as well as numerous magazines and newspapers. His book, Way Up North in Dixie, A Black Family's Claim to the Confederate Anthem, was hailed as the fullest, most finely detailed account of the musical life of a 19th century African-American family anywhere in the United States, and he received an Ohioana Book Award. Dr. Sachs regularly consults with organizations and communities nationwide on rural development and culture. A pioneer in the local food movement, Dr. Sachs served on Governor Strickland's Ohio Food Policy Advisory Council to build an indigenous agricultural system that addresses the needs of all Ohio residents. He raises sheep in his spare time with his wife Judy on their farm in Gambier. So now lots of spare time now that he's retired. So I turn it over to Howard and his presentation of what do we do about Dixie.
Thank you, Tammy. It's a pleasure to be here and to present to those of you who are in the room and those of you who are wherever you are. What I'm going to do today is tell you a story about a song. This song, I Wish I Was in Dixie's Land, or as it's currently known, Dixie. Anybody here heard the song Dixie? Could you tell me any of the words to the song? A little line, a half a line, a phrase?
Way down south of the lake come.
That's right. Do you know the tune at all? Yeah, you could probably whistle a little bit of Dixie. When you think about it, that's remarkable, because this song debuted on the popular stage in April of 1859, over 160 years ago. Can you tell me what the top hit on the pop charts is today? No, neither can I. But you know what the pop song was 160 years ago. You could make the argument that Dixie is the best known song in American history. But Dixie isn't just famous. It's also infamous. It's controversial. Let me just give you a couple of examples. In 1999, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, William Rehnquist, had a picnic, as he did every year. And he invited lawyers and judges. It was obviously very prestigious to be invited to the Chief Justice's picnic. And he always had a sing-along of American songs after the meal. And one of those songs was Dixie. And afterwards, Black lawyers forged a formal protest for his singing of Dixie. Beverly Smith, the president of the National Bar Association, a group of 18,000 African Americans in the legal profession, says, "We are very troubled to learn the Chief Justice did that." She said of the Dixie sing-along. To us, that song is a vestige of the badges of slavery. And just a few weeks ago, in Powell, Ohio, which is part of metropolitan Columbus, one of the cars in the Memorial Day parade blared Dixie and brought protests so vigorous. 4 days after a family said they heard the unofficial Confederacy anthem Dixie's Land playing from a vehicle participating in the Memorial Day parade in Powell, officials have apologized for it. Quote, "We apologize that the song was playing that was deemed culturally inappropriate and offensive by parade guests during the city's annual Memorial Day parade. What do you do about Dixie? For good or ill, this song does not sit, conveniently in a trunk of old sheet music that has been ignored. Now, to understand this, I would argue, to get a handle on this question, you have to understand where the song comes from. What is its history? What cultural baggage is around it? And that's what I want to do today. Dixie was originally presented on the stage in 1859 by this man, Daniel Decatur Emmett, born in 1815 in Mount Vernon, Ohio, about 70 miles from here in rural Knox County. He presented it as the finale of a minstrel show. This is a flyer from that very minstrel show in Mechanics Hall by the premier minstrel troupe of the day, Bryant's Minstrels, of which Dan Emmett was a member. And the finale was Dixie's Land. Now, the minstrel show was a form of theatrical entertainment, stage show. It was a variety show. It had music, it had dance, it had humor, it had stump speeches, and it ended with a raucous, brief, one-act play with a very thin, loose plot. Lots of jokes, lots of slapstick. In the middle of it, some tenor, for no apparent reason, to get up and sing a sentimental song. And it ended with just this crazy, wild finale. If you've ever seen any Marx Brothers film, you have a rough idea of what the finale of the minstrel is. But the most important thing to know about the minstrel show is that it was done in blackface. White performers who blackened their hands and faces and performed as they promoted themselves in the manner of plantation slaves. Now, blackface started in America around 1830, when individual white performers formed characters who would do a little song or a little dance. One of them was a braggart, a crude, rough, physical, tough, boastful guy who dressed in rags and did a little song and a little dance. His name, you know it, but you don't know it. His name was Jim Crow. Ever heard Jim Crow? The laws that segregated blacks and whites after the Civil War in the South. Jim Crow laws. That's how popular and significant in culture this fellow was. You know Jim Crow if you know old television. Do you remember a TV show called Sanford and Son, where Red Fox played the trash man who was rough and crude and boastful? Well, he was still playing within the stereotype of Jim Crow. The other major character to emerge was this fellow, Zip Coon. Zip Coon was the opposite of Jim Crow in a way, as you can see from his dress. He was a dandy, dressed up fancy, had pretensions of being white, tried to be like the white folks were, but he was humorous and funny because he couldn't pull it off. He couldn't do it. You know him too from television in the 70s. Remember the show The Jeffersons, where George Jefferson, moving on up to the east side, strutted around, dressed well, but he was a humorous character because he never quite pulled it off. These characterizations continue in our culture today. Now, in the 1830s, which is when these characters started, individual Ethiopian delineators, as they call themselves, white men who profess to present the people and culture of Africa, Ethiopian delineators, would perform in the circus, that's where Dan Emmett got his start, or in between acts of legitimate theater. So in the 1830s, if you went to see Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet, in between the acts, a blackface minstrel would come out and do song. In 1843, as the story goes, Dan Emmett was with three other of the best pioneer era of minstrels, unemployed in a hotel room in New York City. And Emmett came up with the idea, instead of trying to fit in within these other shows, what if we did a whole evening's entertainment in blackface, the four of us? And they formed the first minstrel band. They called themselves the Virginia Minstrels, and they put on the first minstrel show, a whole evening's entertainment, a variety show in blackface. Here you see a picture of the Virginia Minstrels. This is a picture of sheet music from the early 1840s. They were an immediate sensation. They did a few more gigs up and down the East Coast, and then they went to England. They're like most supergroups, they broke up in the middle of their tour. But when they came back, dozens and dozens of other groups had formed minstrel troupes and were doing minstrel shows. Minstrelsy was so popular that in 1844, there was a minstrel show done in the White House for the president. By the 1850s, there were 10 theatrical venues in New York City with permanent minstrel troupes doing nightly minstrel shows. It was minstrel Broadway. Now the question is, why was minstrelsy so popular? The first reason is that it was the first form of American popular culture. Up until then, American culture was British culture, it was European culture. If you went to the theater, it was Shakespeare. If you went to an art gallery, it was European art. Right? Even the circus, which was a form of mass entertainment, derived from Europe. The minstrel show was the first indigenous form of mass culture, of popular entertainment, that spoke to a newly emerging American population that saw itself as not from the colonies. Look at this picture. Maybe a little hard to see. It's a stage. In the center of the stage is an Ethiopian delineator, Thomas Daddy Rice, Jim Crow, who has just finished his little song and dance. But what else is going on the stage? Who are all those people? It's the audience. They rush the stage. There's a policeman trying to hold them back. Before Beatlemania, before Elvis, the first rock star in America to get that kind of mass hysteria was Thomas Daddy Rice doing Jim Crow. And it's worth noting as an aside that the Beatles, Elvis, and T.D. Rice all use the same formula. White artists covering Black culture. It was pop sensation. That's the first reason. The second reason was that minstrelsy played on a growing nostalgia for the good old days. Think about 1830, when Jim Crow and Zip Coon come along. The steamboat, 1828. Now you can navigate up and down big rivers like the Ohio. They travel a lot easier than the canals. The railroad comes to America in 1830. The Industrial Revolution comes to America around 1830, the cotton mills in Lowell, Massachusetts. Suddenly, everybody's on the move. Going west for opportunities, going from the country to the city. And people, as early as the 1830s and 40s, are lamenting the loss of the good old days, right? When people stayed together on the farm, you know, and it was innocent and the like, right? And the minstrels capitalize on this. There's a whole genre of song that carry me back. Oh, carry me back to old Virginia. Oh, the sun shines bright on my old Kentucky home. This is a piece of minstrel sheet music that has some. Oh, I wish I was in the land of cotton. Old times there are not forgotten. Look away, the Dixie's land. The one part of America that wasn't changing was the South, which was tied to an agricultural way of life rooted in slavery. So all of these songs get couched in terms of the South, and in particular, the slave, the happy, contented, childlike slave who has no cares. Massa takes care of him. He's happy all the day long, playing his banjo. The third reason minstrelsy was so popular had to do with the politics of race. Here's a card representing the Virginia minstrels. As the 30s became the 40s, became the 50s, the issue of race became more and more significant. The so-called Negro problem in America, leading ultimately to the Civil War. And the minstrel show became a forum for playing out concerns about race. They did so by becoming more and more profoundly racist. These are not affectionate characterizations of Black people. They're stereotypes. They demean Black physical appearance, dress, intelligence, culture, art. If you're afraid that free Blacks are going to come up and take your job or marry your daughter, or you're afraid that slavery is going to end and with it your way of life, making Black people subject of ridicule and funny reduces your fear. Make a joke. And that's what minstrelsy did. It certainly satisfied slaveholders and those who were sympathetic to the South, because by demeaning Blacks, how could you give Blacks freedom and equality? They're subhuman. But even abolitionists who approached slaves in a rather paternalistic way saw the inferiority of people of color as being somewhat consistent with their view. Now, the fact that minstrelsy portrayed Black people so negatively seems to be very much in conflict with their professed role as being authentic delineators of African American life. They promoted themselves by saying they collected material from African Americans. They were sort of folklorists presenting Black culture. It also flies in the face of this. Here are two Black musicians, Ben Snowden, the fiddler, on the left, Lou Snowden, the banjo player, on the right, performing from the second-story gable of their home. And on their gravestone, it says, they taught Dixie to Dan Emmett. How could it be that the premier hit of blackface minstrelsy, so profoundly racist a form of popular entertainment, that the song that became the anthem of the Confederacy and was played as Confederates rode into battle in defense of slavery could be written by free Blacks from the North? So let's take another look at Dixie. And instead of looking at it through the lens of a white man, Decatur Emmett, that's a knowledge composer, or of the white men who performed the minstrel shows, or of the white audiences who went to the shows, let's understand Dixie again, but now from the standpoint of the Snowden family, and in particular, the matriarch, the mother of these two men, Ellen Cooper Snowden. With me? Ellen Cooper was born in 1817. Remember, Emmett was born in 1850, so her age groups. In southern Maryland, Charles County, the Nanjemoy district of Charles County, Maryland, right along the Potomac. This is southern Maryland. Here's The Potomac up there would be Washington, DC. The Potomac runs into the Chesapeake, that runs into the Atlantic Ocean. She was born in particular right here. That's Smith's Point. Juts out into the Potomac. It's a little dock area. Right along the river. Now, it's interesting how a river, seemingly objective, can suggest different things to different people. In 1824, when Ellen Cooper would have been a girl, a traveler by the name of Daniel Lord, a white man, was on his way to Savannah, traveled down the Potomac, and he wrote about it in his journal. People wrote journals in those days. This is a most beautiful river, wide and straight. In some places, on very clear days, you can extend your vision to the objects 30 or 40 miles distant. To delineate half the beauties here visible, a painter's skill would be necessary. A beautiful river. But it looked very differently to another person, to a person who would become a famous African-American orator, Frederick Douglass, who, like Ellen Cooper, was born into slavery in Maryland in the same year, 1817. Here's what he said about seeing the Potomac. Those beautiful vessels robed in purest white, so delightful to the eyes of freemen, were to me so many shrouded ghosts. To terrify and torment me with thoughts of my wretched condition, I have often in the deep stillness of summer Sabbath stood all alone upon the lofty banks, and traced with saddened heart the countless numbers of sails moving off to that mighty ocean. The sight of these always affected me powerfully. My thoughts would compel utterance, and there, with no audience but the Almighty, I would pour out my soul's complaint. You are loosed from your moorings and are free. I am fast in my chains and am a slave. You move merrily before the gentle gale, and I sadly before the bloody whip. You are freedom's swift-winged angels that fly around the world. I am confined to these bands of iron. Oh, that I were free. The same object can mean different things to different people. Hold that thought. Now, by the time of the Revolutionary War, Southern Maryland and across the river in Virginia was the center of Black culture. The populations were predominantly African American. There were extended families that lived in the same place for long periods of time, albeit in slavery, and they had a distinctive culture. This is a painting taken in the slave quarters of Thomas Jefferson's plantation just across the river from Manchester. In 1774, on the eve of the Revolutionary War, when Ellen's father, Henry Cooper, was a boy, Nicholas Creswell, a British citizen, visited Nangina, the very spot where Ellen was born, and went to the slave quarters like this and described what he saw. Mr. Bailey and I went to see a Negro ball, Sundays being the only days these poor preachers had to themselves. They generally meet together and amuse themselves with dancing to the banjo. This is incidentally the first time anyone had ever used the word banjo to describe that African instrument. The musical instrument, if it may be so called, is made of a gourd, something in the imitation of a guitar, with only 4 strings and played with the fingers in the same manner. Some of them sing to it, which is very droll music indeed. In their songs, they generally relate the usage they have received from their masters or mistresses in a very satirical style and manner. Their poetry is like their music, rooted and cultivated. Their dancing is the most violent exercise, but so irregular and grotesque, I am not able to describe it. Now, of course, Creswell is looking at African American expressive culture from the standpoint of British standards. So to him, it's rude and uncultivated and violent. But what he is saying is that there is a rich musical and artistic culture going on in the Nanjing district. Ellen Cooper was born in slavery on the plantation of Alexander Greer, one of the most wealthy landowners in the area. And she lived there with the members of her family. This is the property record of Alexander Greer when he died in 1839. And it lists all his property. And listed in all his property are the members of Ellen's family. Remember these names, you'll hear them again. Sophie, age 36, worth $350. A young girl, Ellen. There's Ellen's father, Harry Cooper, worth $125, but he's 64 years old. Why? Because he was the personal manservant of Alexander Greer. Harry Cooper, likely Harry Sr.'s son, and a blacksmith by the name of Tom. These were Ellen's family. Now, Ellen, being a child, would not have gone into the tobacco fields. Children generally didn't do that. And being the daughter of a personal manservant, she probably worked in and about the big house, doing chores, working in the kitchen, that sort of thing. But in 1837, when Ellen was 10 years old, her life changed dramatically. Members of Alexander Greer's extended family emigrated from Antrim County, Ireland, to America. Potato famine, they got out. But there was no real economic opportunity for them in Tidewater, Maryland, so they decided to go west to Knox County, Ohio, what was then the frontier, and had better economic opportunity. And another member of the family, John Greer, had already moved there. Alexander Greer decides to give them Ellen Cooper as a personal servant. So at age 10, Ellen Cooper leaves her family, her culture, everything she knows, to go off to literally the wilderness. We're talking wolves in the woods wilderness, with a bunch of white folks she doesn't know. She moves to northeastern Knox County. The closest black face is 10 miles away, a day's ride. This is a picture of two of those Greers who came from Antrim County, Ireland, with the servant girl, Cooper. Probably taken 7 or 8 years after they got to Knox County, because she looks to be a young woman, maybe 17 or 18 years old. That's Ellen continued to have contact with her family in the South via letter. Here's a letter dated 1837. John Greer would go back and forth occasionally between Knox County and Maryland, and he would bring letters. This is a letter from Ellen's father in 1837. Let me read you just a little bit of it. The part I'm going to read is, and what he does is what any father would do for a daughter far away. Tell her what's going on with the family. Remember those names? You're going to hear right now. Sophia has lately had a daughter, has been very unwell ever since, but not dangerously so. Thomas and Harry are both well and presents their love to you And Thomas hopes you are and will do well. Sophia's daughter, Ellender, who is that little girl, Ellen, requests her love be given to you and her uncle Thomas. Your old master is as well as anyone in his stage of life could possibly expect, and all your old fellow servants are in good health, as could be expected at present. You will give my love to Thomas, that's Ellen's new husband, and tell him I hope he will do everything in his power to render you and himself comfortable here and happy hereafter. Old master is, I hope, preparing to meet his heavenly master as he devotes much time to religious duties and his family. Colonel Greer, that's John Greer, still presses me in case I should survive master to move to Ohio, but time will only determine that event. It's interesting. How do we want to make, what do we want to make of that line? All masters, I hope. Is this a devotional of a trusted servant who hopes his master's doing all right? Or is this him in a sort of satirical way that only Ellen would understand him? I hope this guy dies so I can be with him. It didn't happen. She never saw her father. In 1836, she marries Thomas Snow, and they move to Mount Vernon. They buy a little piece of land, start farming, and have 7 children that grow past infancy. In the 1850s, you're probably wondering what this has to do with Dixie. In the 1850s, the children form a band, the Snowden family band. And they start performing in and around Mount Vernon and as far as 70 miles out, a week's wagon ride away, doing concerts and performances. One of the most unusual things about the band is that they had 2 daughters who were fiddlers. Fiddlers were never women, they were always men. So one of the things that was so interesting about this band was they had 3 fiddles, and one of them was, 2 of them were women. Here's some pictures of the band. This is Lou Snowden, the banjo player you saw before. Interesting picture of a proud man with African knee pads, elbow pads, and headdress, with an African crown at his feet along with his instruments. This is it. And the chain, the watch fob, African ivory beads. This is a proud African American young man. This we think is a picture of Annie with a guitar. But what is interesting about it is this is a post-mortem photograph. In the mid-19th century, it was the habit to take pictures of departed people in their coffins as a remembrance. You rarely see African-American post-mortem photographs. You never see a post-mortem photograph of an African-American. For when music is so important that they put a guitar in her coffin and wrapped her hands around it as if she was playing. That's how important music was. Observe. In addition to performing, the Snowdens were musical resources. Friends, neighbors, and people that saw them perform routinely wrote to them for songs. Here are some of the letters, just to give you a snippet. Dan Simpson writes to Ben, "What are you doing tonight? Singing, laughing, crying, I am half crying. There is a woman in town here that wants you to send her that song, Gathering Up the Shells. You must write me the best song you can think of and send it to me in a letter. Send the tobacco song, if you please." Another letter, Sis, that was Sophia's nickname. "Sis, I want you to write me that song about 40 years ago. I would give all I'm worth if I knew that. Sis, be sure to write me that song if you please, and I will look for a letter in the next mail. Tell Lou I haven't forgotten Hoop-de-doo-doo, another song. Tell Benny I want him to write me the Gresham Band song, and tell him I will speak a good word to some girl out here for him." Not only were they sources of music, They were sources of musical instruction. This is a phenomenal letter written by a neighbor, a white man, George Root. Well, Ben, tell your two sisters, Sophia and Anne, they were the two female fiddlers along with Ben, to practice playing their violins and learn all the new tunes they can play. And I will learn all I can too. I wish I could come and live with you about 1 month. I should like to come and learn to play the violin. And I will give you and Sophia and Anne $100 to let me come and live with you 1 month. That's $25 a piece in summer work. If you three will teach me to play the violin and learn me all the songs you can. I've got my violin strung up now, all 4 strings on now. On the eve of the Civil War, a white farmer is offering a black family $100. That's a lot. To move in with them for a month to learn how to play violin. Now they needed that money too, because in 1856, Thomas Snowden died, leaving Ellen, a widow in her 30s with 7 children and a mortgage to pay. Now, this intimacy between the Snowdens and their white neighbors belies the profound racism that existed in Ohio. Even though it was a free state, they early on enacted black codes to keep blacks as second-class citizens. And Ellen and her family faced all kinds of hardship because of this. Economic hardship. When her husband died, she fell behind in the mortgage, and the richest man in the county who owned the mortgage sued to try to get her off the land. Ultimately, they had to sell a quarter of their farm in order to make the mortgage payments. They started touring to make money to pay rent. They also faced political discrimination. In 1870, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, giving black men the right to vote. Ben Snowden, seen here, and his brother Lou, 4 days later, went to vote in a local election. The polling place was the county schoolhouse where they had been educated. But they were denied the right to vote. And the Republican newspaper was outraged. At the election last Monday, the trustees of Morris Township, that's the township, refused the votes of the Snowdens. The trustees will be prosecuted for their stupid obstinacy. They attempted to justify their action on the ground first that they had no legal evidence that the 15th Amendment was adopted. This is a transparent fallacy. The amendment has force and effect from the time the Secretary of State certifies its ratification. And it goes on. The court case went on for 5 years. In the end, the Snowdens lost and had to pay $25 in the court case. No insignificant fine. They also faced social discrimination. When the Snowdens reached marrying age, there were no other black people in the area for them to marry because the population was so small. Ben Snowden and the Snowden family were friends with a white family, the Simpsons. And Nan Simpson, I read a little letter, bit of a letter from Nan. And Ben fell in love. And they started a date. And they talked about marriage. But those plans were cut off, not by the white woman, but by Ellen Snowden. Why? Because Ellen knew that for blacks to survive in Ohio, they always had to maintain their respectability. And she knew what would happen to them if they married men. Here's an article in the Democratic newspaper, The Period. decrying the editor of the Republican newspaper marrying a Negro to a white man. If you were a black man who married a white woman, you know what was going to happen to you. Lynching was a very distinct possibility. So what do we make of Dixie? Is Dixie the most popular song of minstrelsy, a profoundly racist form of entertainment, known even to this day? Sure is. Was Dixie the Confederate anthem, played as soldiers rode into battle to defend slavery? Yes, it was. But could Dixie also be the lament of Ellen Cooper Snowden, a girl who was torn from her family at age 10, who continued to have contact with that family, who faced hardship, who became a widow in her 30s with 6 children, who almost lost her farm, whose family faced racial and economic discrimination, social discrimination, who lived to see none of her children marry and have children? Could Dixie be a satirical song in the manner of the folk tradition of Black culture in Nanjemoy, where African Americans compose satirical tongue-in-cheek songs about their masters in language that the masters and the white people wouldn't understand, but they would? Henry Louis Gates, in other words, you know, if it's a lament, it's a pre-blues, but what it could be is a satirical song. I wish I wasn't Dixie, not. I hope Master is preparing for his demise because he studies the Bible, not. Henry Louis Gates, the African-American scholar, talks about a prominent element of African-American culture called signifying, where African-Americans essentially invert the meaning of words to have a secret language that they understand but whites don't. So if you're walking down the street and I say, wow, you look bad. I said, what do you mean I look bad? I'm in a sport coat, I'm dressed in my fine. Bad means good. So maybe this song is, I wish I wasn't Dixie. Nah. I'll finish this story with an anecdote. When my wife and I were doing research for our book, Way Up North of Dixie, we traveled down to the Nanjemoy district of Maryland. And a Black caretaker took us to the very spot where Alexander Greer had his plantation, where Ellen Cooper was born and raised. When we went down to the Potomac, the very spot where Ellen would have left Nanjemoy. Excuse me, because in those days, the roads were terrible. If you traveled, it was by river, you get on a boat. So the Greer family and Ellen Cooper would have left Nanjemoy by getting on a boat, going up to Washington, getting on a national road. So here's the spot, 10-year-old Ellen, about to leave everything she knows. My wife, and there was a little wood dock there. There was some African-American locals fishing around. And she reaches under and she scoops up a handful of sand and seashells. Because this is tidewater Maryland. And the Potomac is fed by the Chesapeake, fed by the Atlantic, and high tide brings in sand and seashells. And the land here is this undulating bottomland. That's why there aren't any good roads. And it fills with sand and seashells. And you know, the one-room schoolhouse just above it was near the Sandy Field School. Everything is sandy bottom. And then we turned from here, looked up the hill. The top of the hill is where the Greer house would be, where Ellen had lived, played. And we asked the black caretaker, are there any persimmon trees around here? And with a wave of his hand across the landscape, he says, symmetry there, symmetry there, symmetry there, symmetries all over these parts. And we remember the first verse of the song Dixie. The original first verse of the song Dixie, what scholars have said is the first version. Oh, I wish I was in the land of cotton, cinnamon seed and sandy bottom. What in the world did cinnamon seed and sandy bottom have meant to Daniel Decatur and born and raised in Mount Vernon, Ohio? But to Ellen Cooper Snow in the 1850s, not looking nostalgically at slavery, but recalling her family and her culture that she was separated from as a girl, a newly formed widow with 7 children to feed, about to lose her farm in a state where discrimination is profound. She might have looked back somewhat nostalgically at the land of cinnamon seed and sandy bottom. So there's another story about Dixie. So the question is, what do you do about Dixie? What do you do about Dixie at a Confederate reenactment at Zoar in September? Do you play it? Do you ban it? What do you do about Dixie in the Powell Memorial Day Parade? What do you do about the Confederate flag? What do you do about monuments to veterans of the Confederacy? I raise the question. Let me stop there. If you here or on Zoom have thoughts, questions, responses to the big question, what do you do about Dixie? Let's talk.
And then on Zoom, if you do have a question or if you would like to present a comment, please put it in the chat and then I'll have you unmute yourself so you can ask your question, or if you prefer, I can read your question out loud as well. So if you go to the chat feature, then you can put your questions there.
Yeah, I think in the context of the song being adopted by the Confederates, and in the context of like out here when we have the reenactment, I think then it becomes a problem for me. And I'm just saying from my personal opinion. Everybody I'm sure has an opinion about it, but the Confederate enactment's great. When we celebrate both sides because the survivors and the people that died trying to do what they could for their society. It's all good, but I think when we get into that aspect of, connecting it with a rebel cause that created a lot of death and destruction in our society itself, that I think to me, it's a problem. But again, maybe it's just me.
So we ban it?
Yeah, that's in my opinion, it's okay if they do whatever they do. But my personal opinion is I wouldn't want to suppress that because of the connection of it's an extreme celebration of a rebel cause that brings death and destruction to our nation, in my opinion.
Yeah, what do we do with problematic and inconvenient facts of our history? I mean, it's sort of like
That just came up today because they removed statue of Stonewall Jackson. three of us.
Yeah, there's barely a newspaper, anymore that doesn't have something like that. So, what's the old saying? Those who don't, learn the mistakes of history are destined to repeat them. There's a danger in every generation coming along and sweeping those things under the rug and creating a sort of antiseptic view of our history, which then gets changed, a generation later. And yet, on the other hand, these elements of history carry profound meanings that are very problematic in contemporary society. You can't separate Dixie from the Confederacy, from slavery, from segregation, from racism, and today from white supremacy.
I think in the case of the reenactment, it is a reenactment. You are trying to present facts as they were. And that was right on that day in the launching battle. And every one of those Confederate boys fought for what they believed in, just like the Union boys did. Even though we know now today what the suppression that we impose people, but they fought for what they believed in, and that was their song. And so you want to present it as it was then. You don't want to say, tell people that absorb that never existed.
But what do you do? And I'm just being devil's advocate here. I'm not disagreeing with anything anybody said. But what do you do? Because that is being presented not in 1863, but in 2021, where sensibilities are different and where for generations, people of color have been intimidated by the playing of Dixie, and now confront that and say, well, this is a factual presentation. Yeah, but that presentation has been used for 150 years to keep me down, and that's not okay. One answer, I think, a couple of things. One is that we know that the meaning of things, songs, flags, statues, even rivers, vary depending on your position in the society. If you're black or white, if you're male or female, if you're rich or poor. The meanings also change, as we've just said, across time. What Dixie meant in 1859 on the minstrel stage is different from what it meant in 1863 at the Battle of Gettysburg, is different from what it means today in historic reenactment. So meanings are fluid. You can't say this one's the right meaning, this one's the wrong meaning. That's what makes this so difficult, But on the other hand, I think there's a tendency in America to make meaning and truth something that is reduced to here's how I feel as an individual. It's heritage, not hate for me, so that's true. It's racist for me, so that's true. And I think there's a danger in reducing truth and meaning, even though it's fluid and it depends, simply reducing it down to my personal feeling. So if I'm offended by it personally, that's all there is to be said about it. It's not that easy. Because we're not little atoms that float around in free space. We're social creatures. We live in communities. So we also have to ask what the meaning and significance of this is for us as a community. It was interesting to me in that respect that the Powell City Council, they didn't just apologize, they said, this event doesn't characterize our community. We are a community that is continually striving to promote diversity and inclusion to ensure that the city of Powell is a community in which all individuals feel welcome and included. That's a sort of social fact. That's a moral statement that says, as a community, this is what is important to all of us to benefit and live together. Therefore, we look at these moves in that context. You know, it's interesting. In PAL, you can say, and you suggest, you know, it's problematic to play that there. But here, in this lecture, I quoted Dixie. If I said, let's play the song and look at it, think about it in terms of minstrel show and Ellen Cooper Snowden's life and everything, you probably would have been all right with that. Why? Because we contextualized it, we interpreted it. We said, let's sit down and look at the meaning of this. Let's not just blare it. Let's not just play it as we go into battle. So maybe in the case of the Civil War reenactment, you say, we're going to play it, but we're also going to do a little workshop, or we're going to have a little flyer that talks about Dixie and what it is and what the story of Dixie is and how it has different meanings. And we're playing it here because to understand the Civil War, you had to experience this, and you know, do that. I don't think we do enough of that anymore. I mean, that's what the humanities are. You know, the humanities are, let's understand this in terms of its meaning for our collective lives. You know, I'm inclined to go that direction when we can. You know, so maybe that says, now public monuments are problematic. Public monuments are, this is what we stand for and believe in. So that's a very strident statement. But maybe if that monument goes to the Cleveland Historical Society Museum with a panel that says, this is what it was, this is who put it up. It's probably the daughters of Confederate veterans at the time when they were using it to run segregation. And here's why it got taken down. It still exists, but it's contextual. It's a difficult subject. And then you just listen to Dixie.
Those other verses, I've never heard or seen those. You know, I always think it's a chorus largely, but those are really characteristically, you know, not written by, say, a northerner living in
Right.
town.
Well,
You know, it's somebody who experienced, you know, maybe firsthand.
Well, I look at it as, I interpret it as the recollections of a young girl who's running around the big house.
Sure.
It's a sort of woman's perspective because it's all about the mistress of the house who falls for some guy and who breaks her heart. You know? And then just to give you another couple lines, I'm so glad she raised this. Look at this one. William, who was the guy who, you know, seduces, you know, the mistress. William was a gay deceiver. Look away. When he put his arm around her, he looked as fierce as a 40-pounder. What's a 40-pounder? A 40-pounder is a cannonball that was used in the War of 1812 when the British went right past this point, bombing that whole area on their way up to Washington to lay siege to Washington. So if you lived along that coast where Ellen did, everybody knew what a 40-pounder was, including the young girl, Ellen. One more, another, here's to the health of the next old missus and all the gals that want kisses. That would be another one of those satirical comments. You know, here's to the health of Massa. You know, there are lots of examples in Caribbean and African American culture of this signifying thing. Here's to the health of Massa, and everybody's, you know, sitting there laughing because they know it's not ironic. And then one more. Hoe it down and scratch your gravel. Charles County was tobacco country one time. And the labor of African Americans in slavery was to go and weed the tobacco plants so the weeds didn't choke them out. It was very labor intensive. So they would use a hoe it down and scratch the gravel and soil with the weeds. That's another reference. One reference is to tobacco. So it's really interesting to read those lyrics, and I think not only do they not speak to being a white guy in Ohio, or even to sort of standard trope lyrics of minstrel songs. I mean, because there's a lot of that. The references here go back right to Ellen and to Angela and the like. What often happens when pop culture draws from traditional culture, because it's rooted in the community, always has lots of local references to it, songs, poems, things like that, because it's all about affirming our lives in this community. Pop culture is supposed to reach a mass audience, so the words have to change so that you and I can relate to it. So Simmons, I wish I was a land of cotton, Simmons, sea, and sandy bottom. By the time that song was first published in 1860, it's I wish I was a land of cotton, old times there, not forgotten. So these lyrics change for just that reason. But it's fascinating to look at the words through the lens of Ellen Cooper Snowden's life. The last words Ellen Cooper Snowden ever said, which were repeated in her obituary in the paper, 1 week before she dies in 1889, doesn't say a thing about her life in Ohio. Her last words, I am the last of that little colony that came out here from Maryland so many years ago. That's where her head was at. Well, thank you very much. I hope you feel good with that.